My towers, my towers, my towers.
Khotso Mokhele, viva!
Comrade Program Director. I'm not so sure whether I should say Comrade President or not, but Comrade Musala. I'm standing here in front of the comrades after a long time that I found myself standing in front of the comrades, and I'm here. When I walked in and I saw Comrade George Biya, I felt safe. When I saw Comrade Pandelani, I felt very safe. And when Comrade Ziti walked in, I remembered something that, you still haunt Comrade Tagaza Mufuke Mata. You still haunt, he still talks about you and what you once did to him. Matawas, when Comrade Musala called me on Friday to come and share reflections with you, he wanted me to focus on the topic of black people and science. Now, I'm a little intimidated to speak about it given some of the interventions, Comrade Program Director, that came after Comrade Strike and before me. I'm kind of intimidated now because I don't know whether I'm out of place or not. Because I'm picking up a certain anti-intellectual sense that scares the shit out of me. I'm not saying that it is not all about grassroots, because it is. But if we think it is all about grassroots and not about intellect and science, then we're misguided. We will still be here 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. So if I speak out of 10, forgive you me, I'm going to do what Comrade Musala asked me to come here and do. Whether you find it appropriate as a point of conversation in the life of this movement now or not, I will do justice, Matawa, to what you asked me to come here and do. I didn't do the vivas because I thought Comrade Strike did all the vivas that can be done. All I'm going to say is, One Azania!
One nation!
One nation!
One Azania!
That's all I'll do, Comrade Strike. The others, I left them to you. I was kind of, when you finished Comrade Strike, I was disappointed that Comrade Musala was not in the room. I've always been Khotso Mokhele. I was never somebody else Mokhele first, then became Khotso Mokhele later. So I said to Comrade Musala, let me frame my reflection on how the BC movement, how black consciousness made me a scientist. And I'm particularly pleased that there's somebody else in this audience that will become relevant very shortly. I matriculated at a school in Tabanchu called Moroka High School in 1973. Moroka was originally a Methodist school. By the time I went there, the school, the academic program was run by the Department of Bantu Education. The boarding section was still run by the Methodist Church. This tower sitting to my left once came to preach at that school. And we still talk about that sermon even today. 1972 he came. I don't even know whether he still remembers the sermon, but I do. Moroka was a school where, in Form 4, all our teachers were white except the teacher who taught us Setswana or Sesotho. It changed in Form 5 because the brilliant Afrikaner mathematics teacher, Meneer Wiese, left, went to Namibia, And we got a black teacher who could not teach mathematics in Afrikaans. So it was a hopeless situation for us. We had lost this brilliant Afrikaner mathematician, absolutely brilliant, replaced by a brilliant black mathematician who could not teach in Afrikaans. And he walked into class and said, but we had matric to write. He had a problem, which meant that we had a problem. It so happens that year, 1973, there was a strike at Fort Hare, Comrade strike, you'll remember. The Teflop strike was in 72, Comrade Neff. The Fort Hare strike was in 73. And one of the students from Morocco, from Fort Hare, who happened to live in Tabanchu, was Comrade Menziwe Mbeu. So Comrade Menziwe, like all the students, when they were expelled, came home. And because we did not want that engagement with him to get either him or us into trouble, we arranged that he came to speak to us, and the venue was a football field, and it was at night. We couldn't use the classrooms because of what he was coming to talk to us about. So we went to the football field, and he spoke to us there about what happened at Fort Hare, and did what Comrade Strike spoke to us about when the strike happened at Teflop in 1972. They did not go home, Comrade Strike told us. They went into the villages to go and conscientize into the schools. So standing before you now is a person who became a scientist because of that conscientization project. So I want the towers who say the big English thing, this movement has allowed itself to be intimidated away from what it really is. This movement used to get insulted that all it is an intellectual movement. And it turned the movement into an anti-intellectual structure to be able to deal with the ridicule. And I'll come back to this anti-intellectual thing because it is deeper than you think. Let's not fall into that trap. And I'm kind of going to that point, the comrades from Bekkersdal. I'm going to that point of why it is so important for us to be intellectual and not allow ourselves to be pushed into this anti-intellectual hole, because when they talk about us, they say all we are intellectuals. But I'll tell you why they do that. So Comrade Menziwe comes and talks to us. And the comrade from Bekkersdal reminds us of black men, you're on your own. He tells us that if we pass matric at Morocco, what kind of institution will we go to if we went to Teflop, Fort Hare, and Zululand? What are we going to encounter in terms of the attitudes of those who will be teaching us, hating every minute of the time they spend in the classrooms with us? And he told us, Matawa, that we were on our own. Our response to that was to form study groups. My class, Form 5A, formed study groups. My group was called the Big Eight. And we taught one another. I can tell you now, there are people who would not have passed matric, Comrade George Bia, and without belonging to those study groups. The long and the short of the story is that out of that class, Form 5A 1973, 2 PhDs came out. And those 2 PhDs are in this room today. It's me and Comrade Stranger Khampe, and I want him to stand up. Yeah. Direct products of that conscientization exercise by Comrade Menziwe Mbeu. Later on, he had his difficulties within this movement. But I stand here as a product of that Tiro project, Comrade Strike, at Teflop, that BC project, Comrade Neff, that went all over the country. This is what the BC movement is capable of producing. After Polokwane, that big ANC meeting in Polokwane, I found myself in a very strange space where I believe that the governing party had been able over time to manage itself so tightly internally that the happenings at Polokwane would not happen. So I wanted to understand why those happenings happened. So when you want to understand, you go to those who know. So I phoned about 10 people to say, please come and explain, how did I miss this one? How did I miss that it is capable of getting as ugly as it got? One of those people that I called, because we had to call the people who know, right? I couldn't call Comrade Neff. He didn't know. He was not there. I had to call the people who know. One of those was Moeletsi Mbeki. And had a conversation with him, which comes back to this intellectual, anti-intellectual thing, which is very key. I'm changing what I was going to say because of what was said before me. And I'm kind of reacting and responding to it a little bit. Amongst the many things that he said that what people in this country must remember, that when the regime in this country first interacted with the now governing party, the first interface of that interaction was economic. He reminded me that the first interaction between Maburu and the governing party now was an economic interaction in Dakar, Senegal. Economic agreements were reached first. And once those economic agreements were reached, the path was then paved for the political agreement. And I think we tend to forget that it was first when the Reddies and the Ruperts went to Dakar, the conversations were economic there. They were not political. And once the economic guarantees were given, the path to the politics was smoothed. That's why many of you will remember I stood at the council meeting in Bloemfontein called Mangaung now and the follow-up special congress in Berghersdal against participation in negotiations. The reason I did was because the train had long left the station. That's one thing that Moeletsi reminded me of.
There was no train to get in.
Absolutely, it was gone.
I just want to get it right. Sometimes people think there's still a train. There's no train to get on.
But the even more devastating thing that he says, and I think we need to wrap our minds around this particular issue, is that and I'm quoting almost verbatim now, the elite of the governing party, I'm not going to say ruling party, because that's bad language. Bad language. When people say ruling party, it's actually quite, you know who rules. And you know those who are ruled, what they're expected to do when they are ruled. So it's not a ruling party, it's a governing party. He says that the elite of the governing party realized that the longevity of their stay in power can only be guaranteed, listen to this, Matthaus, if they established an alliance between themselves and the poor and ignorant majority. I'm going to say it again. The longevity in power will only be guaranteed if they have a sustained alliance with the poor and ignorant majority. So when the head of state says the only problem in this country are educated black people, when the head of state says only clever people think there's a problem in Gandla, they're pushing us back into that anti-intellectual hole, Mathawas, that you must be so careful about.
But he's actually right from his point of view.
From his point of view.
You are the problem.
Absolutely. And so we therefore have to understand what the project is. The project, I get lots of contacts from young people that I know and that I don't know, that pick you up on Facebook and Google and what have you, asking for help in finding jobs and so forth. I had a conversation with one last week. She just finished an honors degree at University of Limpopo, and she wants an internship. Now, maybe 10% of the time I can help, 90% of the time I can't help. And she sends me her transcripts. And doing well, including the matric results, doing relatively well. And she got 92% in matric results. In, what's this subject now where, this funny one? No. No. The lifelong one, life one. Life orientation. So she has 92% in life orientation. So I say to her that, why are you doing so well in this life orientation relative to the other subjects? And she said, all I had to remember was to eat apples, to drink juices, and to abstain. And you got 90%. It's laughable if it was not as sad as it is. When 33% becomes a pass, Mathawas, then whatever the motivation of Moeletsi Mbeki is against the governing party to make some of those statements becomes irrelevant, because you now have data and evidence that supports the point that he's making. Stranger Khampe and I used to be shambok like you won't believe for not getting 70% in biology. You used to be beaten ruthlessly for not getting 70%. I have a friend whose father used to punish her for getting 92%. But what were you doing with the other 8%? That was the level of excellence that our society had embraced and embedded in it. How to number one got classing Comrade Neff like I used to, as you know. The whole community would come and thank you and congratulate you and take pride in your achievements. Let me talk about the science now that Comrade Musala said I must talk about. I just had to react, Mathawa, to what I thought is a trend that, in my view, we must not allow to gather steam and momentum in this movement, because it'll set us back. Because we'll be playing right into the hands of what number one in Tshwane wants to see happening in this country. Maburu, on the other hand, this country is with 54, 55 million people. It's difficult to know how many we are, because I don't know how many Somalis we have, and whether they get counted, not counted, I'm not sure. We're at the southern tip of the African continent, but this country is in every science conversation that takes place globally. the only African country that's in those conversations. Partly because global geopolitics makes it impossible now for what is now called the developed world to speak by itself without some developing world presence in the room. And South Africa is a very convenient country to include. I don't want to be controversial, but I've taken the trouble to come here, Kurumnusala, so I might as well say stuff that needs to be said. When the government was put together in 1994, have you ever wondered why, as the portfolios were divided up between parties, why the governing party decided that the science and technology portfolio is dispensable? This organization benefited from that generosity, but why? Have you ever asked yourself, of all the other portfolios, why was that one deemed dispensable? To be given to the Inkatha Freedom Party and to be given to AZAPO. Go back to Mwele Zimbeki's statement. Because it was never part of the project of the party now governing this country. So it could give it to AZAPO, could give it to the IFP, who would not be in the NEC meetings when the real policy of government is discussed. So you end up being a minister in a government where you're not there when the government decides what it's going to do. On the other hand, the apartheid agenda had science at its core. The way the Western-dominated world has constructed itself now has science at its core. So to be excluded from science, you're being excluded from core, and black people in this country are even more excluded than they were before because they don't have the Tiros and the Menzuembewos to come and tell them that you're on your own. Therefore, you're going to pass that mathematics on your own. So the exclusion, does anybody here know Sandile Ngcobo? Not the judge. You know Sandile Ngcobo, the young Sandile Ngcobo, at the CSR, National Laser Center, the CSR. That boy did remarkable work. Remarkable work. And for that, he is rightfully being acknowledged. But he's also being over-acknowledged because he's so exceptional. Because we don't have black people who are like him. So we're over acknowledging young men, and let me tell you what's going to happen to him as we acknowledge him to the extent that we do. He's going to be pulled out of the laboratory because he's going to sit on every committee. But his white counterpart, who may have done work that's even better than Sandile's, will remain in the laboratory and continue doing science and continue to progress. 10 years from now, Sandile Ngcobo is irrelevant because his science ended 10 years earlier, because he sits in all committees and everybody wants to parade him. This is what is happening to black people in science in our system. And we don't have Onkgopotse Tiro anymore to remind us what the real thing is. And that's why when many lament what became of this movement, that's what they're talking about. When people glibly say this country needs black conscience now more than before, I don't even think half of them understand what that statement implies. But it does. And the project is made, I mean, I like the quotation that you use in the message that you sent yesterday, at one of the Cabral quotations, I think, that it'll take Bill Clinton and not the Republicans in the US to get the working class in the US to accept their diminished status. So it'll take a black government in this country to make black people accept their diminished status. So today, 20 years after 1994, Khotso Mokhele, Stranger Khampe, Sandile Ngobo remain exceptional. Why am I exceptional? I haven't done science in 22 years because there's so few people who have the PhD that you continue to acknowledge me when I have no business being acknowledged anymore. There should be 26, 27-year-olds who are all over the place that you don't need me because I'm washed out. I am washed out. And if Tiro has to be relevant, if this movement has to be relevant, that's how it is going to be relevant. By fighting a struggle that's even more insidious than the pre-1994 struggle. It's more insidious because many of us in the BC movement find it very difficult to publicly castigate the governing party because it is led by black people. And we know our criticism of them publicly is going to be used by others to say, you see, even your people are saying the same things. So what do? We do it privately. But we also do it privately because we are so caught up in the patronage system that if we do it publicly, they will punish us. They will get us. And when the Germans write their history, they will remind us all that that's exactly the mistake they made. They're afraid to be punished by those in control, and therefore we speak in harsh tones. It's all about science in the modern world. Your children will tell you that if you have any doubts about it. But unfortunately, and those in this room who make good salaries, you'd also bear testimony to how difficult it's becoming for us, those with good salaries, to get our children to finish matric. Those of us with good salaries now, those whose parents can afford to send them to university, are saying to their parents, why should I go, my papa? Ma'am, I get a thing with your connections. It's become about patronage, and it is particularly those who come from families that can afford. Has this country ever needed black consciousness? I do not believe it ever needed it like it does now. Amanda! One Azania!
One nation.
You'll always find something.